Gathering early one August morning in the little frontier village of Darrington, nestled in the shadow of Whitehorse Mountain, a group of mountaineers started out to explore the high country in and around Glacier Peak. By 7 a.m. the speeder was loaded with the party and their personal outfits, heading for the junction of the White Chuck and the Sauk River, where the packer awaited with the horses. At noon, we arrived at Stewjack Creek, a crystal-clear mountain stream rushing over a rock-strewn bed. Here we had lunch and a smoke, as no smoking was allowed on the trail while we were traveling over this restricted area. The trip through the rich bottomland, where thickly grew the virgin timber, was like some fairy picture. Gigantic trees, cedar, Douglas fir, and pine were everywhere, many of them 10 feet in diameter, that were fair-sized trees long before Columbus discovered America. As the evening shadows were slanting towards the east, we arrived at Camp Creek, where a hearty meal was served, cooked by our efficient chef over an open fire. Camp Creek was a pretty spot, with a stream coming down from the mountain above and joining the White Chuck about 500 yards below. We followed the White Chuck River, eventually arriving at Kennedy Hot Springs, where we disturbed some mountain goats drinking of the salty water. The hot springs, bubbling up from the depths below, has temperature of about 102 degrees and tastes like sulfur and magnesia. The water is not bad to drink, and I understand has medicinal properties. On Sunday, the party started to explore the Lake Byron district, situated high in the mountains. For part way, we followed the Mountain Goat Trail, which, by the way, usually goes straight up. We paused here for some time, loath to take ourselves away from this peaceful beauty. Dan Kessler, a young ordained minister of the English Lutheran Church, was one of the party. Services were held this Sunday, high above the clouds. Gathered on the hillside, with Glacier Peak far across a deep canyon, shyly peeping out occasionally from her mantle of fog, we listened to Sunday services conducted by Dan, who stood on the margin of the lake. I have heard and forgotten many services, but never shall I forget this personal talk by the lapping shores of Lake Byron. Lake Byron was full of fish. We caught many to take back to camp, each averaging about 12 inches. 26 in all, and I have a cause to remember this number. Shortly after we arrived at the lake, we had a guessing contest to find out who comes nearest to estimating the altitude of the climb we had made from Kennedy Hot Springs. Unfortunately, I was the poorest guesser, and the penalty for lack of judgment was to clean the fish, a task I don't mind saying I dislike. F.W. Cleater, recreational engineer for the U.S. Forest Service, took notes along the way as to possible grades for a Skyline trail and campsites. We hope that this trip will bear fruit, and in the near future, through the efforts of the association, this area will eventually be saved for the coming generations of mountaineers. At an entrancing waterfall on the rushing White Chalk River, we rested and waited on the remaining boys who had tarried on the way. Lingering here until the pack train appeared, we shot a few feet of movie film of the entire party crossing the narrow log bridge spanning the river. A complete record of movies was taken of the entire trip, some 700 feet in all. Eventually, we reached our camping place above timberline on a beautiful meadow situated near the base of Glacier Peak. To get there, we passed through some of the most wonderful alpine meadows. To the north of us stood Glacier Peak with her living glaciers radiating from her sloping sides and her crown partly hidden behind some fleecy clouds. The pictures taken from the vicinity of the lean-to will give you some idea of the beauty we beheld. A short distance from our camping place stood a great cinder cone. It reminded us perhaps of the period when Glacier Peak belched forth its fiery refuse. Early morning, we broke camp and started over Red Pass. Leaving the meadows, we entered a rocky canyon that winds its dizzy way up towards the summit. Hemmed in by towering cliffs with immense boulders broken off from the walls above, the uninviting floor of this canyon offered no foothold to vegetation of any description. Red Pass is a narrow defile high in the mountains about 40 feet wide. From here, one looks down into the valley of the White Chalk on one side, and on the other, 4,000 feet below, the valley of the Sauk. In the far distance, through the clear upper air, faintly seen through the heat haze, stood majestic Mount Rainier, towering towards the heavens at 14,408 feet. White Pass is the dividing line between the eastern and western slopes of the Cascades. Snoqualmie National Forest on the west and Wenatchee National Forest on the east. Camp was established at White Pass. A little stream tripped along beside our camp, tumbling over the plateau on its way to the valley below. At the edge of the meadow lay a snowbank, providing us a way to keep our perishable supplies. As we intended to stay here a few days, we took the trouble to erect the tents and afforded us some measure of protection from the prevailing cold winds at night. In a very short time, we had fashioned a water system by damming up the stream with stones and moss and inserting a piece of pipe we carried for just such a purpose. Farther down the creek, we also built a pool for bathing. A bouquet of mountain flowers, gathered a few feet from the camp, consisted of hellebore, asters, smartweed, monkey flower, and harsh marigolds. The alpine meadows offer wonderful pasture to the large bands of sheep that graze here. This grazing land is leased from the U.S. Forest Service by the sheep farmers of eastern Washington. In the early summer, the sheep herder starts with his band of sheep and raises them slowly through the meadows. Here in this pasture land, they have their young. Very slowly, the band wanders throughout the summer to the various pastures, eventually getting towards their home in the late part of September before the snow flies in the mountains. We found ptarmigan almost everywhere, some with a flock of chicks following them, and so tame that we found it easy and simple matter to take pictures at very close range. Towards the afternoon on the day we made camp at White Pass, Carpenter and myself, accompanied by 4 of the other boys, started off towards Glacier Peak with the intention of looking it over, preparing to climb the peak on the following day. We followed the abandoned sheep trails along the ridge to a point where we could look down on White Chuck Glacier. After climbing over White Chuck Glacier for some time, we found a vantage point and with the aid of our glasses mapped out what we thought would be a practical and safe way to gain the summit of the peak at 10,436 feet. The route that we mapped out proved to be correct and the only feasible way to make the climb. On all sides of this imposing peak crawled the huge glacial bodies, gnawing their way down the mountainside and splitting its surface into rugged ridges. After climbing Glacier Peak, 6 of us started off early one morning to find Blue Lake. Milton Furness from the State Game Warden's office carried on a pack horse 15,000 fish eggs. His instructions were to officially plant the lake, if it was possible. This was quite an undertaking, as the lake, according to our maps, was situated in a rather inaccessible part of the mountains. Leading the horses, we worked our way along the face of the bluff. To look down to the depths below was rather awesome. Cactus, Ellis, Furness, and myself with the horses made the summit over a side hill trail that was really not a trail, but a dusty, slippery, rock-strewn groove on the face of the mountain. As we made the last 100 feet of many switchbacks, owing to the steepness, we looked down on the other side and beheld the lake nestled in the lap of a mountain basin, a sapphire blue. The drop down to the lake was very steep and it was impossible to take the horses any further, so the other 3 boys, leaving me with the horses, loaded the fish eggs on their backs and worked their way down to the lake. Cactus, a young lad raised on the plains and rough and ready in his manner, was an efficient packer, ever ready to help and never known to complain. An ideal person for such a trip. Many pretty lakelets gem the surface of the meadows, their mirrored face reflecting the sky and trees above. All are drained by trickling streamlets that form miniature waterfalls as they meander along on their way to some larger stream. On our homeward journey, it was a drop of almost 5,000 feet. It took us from the high country above timberline to the headwaters of the Sauk River, a beautiful stream that winds its way many miles through the Virgin Valley to eventually find its way to the Skagit River. Again, we found our friends, the firs, the hemlocks, and cedars stretching out their branches as if to welcome us back from our weary climb. Towards the afternoon, we arrived at Sloan Creek, our last camping place. In the course of time, we arrived back at Darrington, our jumping off place, ending for us the cruise of the Skyline Trail, one of the most wonderful parts of the Cascade Range I have been fortunate enough to explore. J. Allison.